Hi everybody, my name is Eric Warnicki, and I wanted to just make a random video today. The other day I watched this like 2.5 hour documentary about this guy called Pirate Software, and it's just been kind of living in my head rent free for the past few days. And so I just wanted to be as neutral as possible and get some thoughts out there about this topic because I know that everybody is supremely heated about this and hyped up, and so I'm going 180 the opposite direction, and I am cooling down and taking a 10,000 foot view of the situation. And I'm just going to give some analysis, some thoughts on what I think might be going on here based off of my life experience, and just kind of see where we end up with this video. I have no clue what I'm saying here, but there's a guy. His name is Jason Thor Hall, and his dad worked for a very long time at a successful video game company called Blizzard, and they made this whole bunch of games, including Overwatch and World of Warcraft and original Warcraft and Starcraft and a whole bunch of games like that people really like. And so, the first thing I'll talk about is this sort of allegation that he's a nepo baby. Yes and no, right? My thoughts on that are if somebody's talented, they should have a shot at an industry. Even if their parents are in the same industry, or even if they sort of got that connection easier. I think if somebody's talented, they're going to stick around. And if they're not talented, they're going to be out of there, regardless of whether their parents are successful or not. And so I don't really, hate him for that. And I don't think that there's too much validation, to that people who will suck at their jobs, get to keep them just because of who their parents are. Maybe it's true. Maybe I'm naive, but that's my kind of thought on that. The second thing I want to address is a lot of people are talking about this woman named Lyric. I guess he was married when he was 31 and started having some sort of emotional online affair with a girl that was 20. And so my thoughts on that are, if a crime happened, it should be with the police, right? And it shouldn't necessarily be in the court of public opinion. I don't really have the time to read all of those logs. I'm sure they were weird and strange, and I'm not interested really. But my thought on that is, if something criminal happened, then you let the police look into that. And the other thing I think, that's interesting is I guess he got his start a long time ago making like furry outfits or skins for a game which is called Second Life, which is kind of like an old role playing game, from 20 years ago approximately. And he made money allegedly, just selling skins on there. And he used to pretend, he would claim that he was a furry in order to sort of fit in with the other furries so that they would pay more money to him. And so, whether that's true or not, whether he really was a furry that's interested in the furry fandom and has some sort of kink related to furry stuff, or whether he really was sort of manipulating and using them, um, it's up to you to decide which one you think is worse. You know what I mean? But either way, it's not good. This one would be kind of disingenuous, and it would be dishonest in that way. You know what I mean? Somebody that conducts business in that way dishonestly, somebody that will pretend to be like Jewish in order to get Jewish clients, or pretend to be Christian to get Christian clients. These kind of chameleons, like a politician, that can morph in whatever environment they are. That's a little bit strange, and that's sort of a symptom of a lot of different personality disorders. Is this sort of unknown feeling on the inside of where you belong in the world, and so BPD, borderline personality disorder, is very common with that. A lot of people with that condition don't know where they belong in the world, and they'll easily fit in, with a cult or a religion or a group, that will have them, and they'll become very involved in that, until there's a falling out or something. And so you can see, that he has this sense of wanting to belong, to Second Life communities, and then to this World of Warcraft community, and then to this YouTube community, and to this video game developer community, to this security penetration, ops kind of community. He really wants to belong to a lot of different communities and get praise from these communities. And so I think that a big part of his personality has to do with a need for validation and a need for praise. And, when his actual experiences, what I mean, and accomplishments in life don't line up with what his, ego needs, what I mean, he will bridge the gap by creating stories. And so that's a big part of this, is just how strong his urge for praise is, and I think that's an interesting thing. You've got to wonder, where this need for praise actually comes from. And then the other thing that I don't see a lot of people talking about with him is a very strong hedonistic nature. He's a hedonist, to put it in plain words. And what that means is that he always seeks pleasure. Much like electricity will always seek the path of least resistance. He'll do the same thing. He'll take whatever path requires him to do the least amount of work, and will allow him to get the most pleasure. So, about being married and texting, having affairs online and things like that with other people, of course, that's hedonistic nature. There's a lot of examples of him sort of seeking pleasure and prioritizing his own well-being before the needs of other people. And so I think, the segue into the biggest thing that I see people talking about is this failed raid that he was doing in World of Warcraft. So what I understand is that he bragged to people for a very long time that he is some sort of expert WoW player. He used to work at Blizzard, and so of course I'm fantastic. I'm sure he alluded in some way that he was a dev for it, which, from what I understand, is not true on that game. But when he actually plays with people and streams on these videos, and in this one famous video, when they're doing some sort of end game boss run to try to beat this dungeon, things start going south, and he's the mage, the healer of the group, one of them, from what I understand. And he sees trouble, and the phrase is like a cockroach: when you turn on a light or when there's trouble, a cockroach will scatter. And so he roached out of the situation and abandoned his teammates, claiming he couldn't do anything, but apparently he had items allowing him to refill his mana, and he also misclicked, either intentionally or accidentally, wasting mana while he was fleeing from the battle. And when your healer flees from battle, it's pretty hard to recover from that. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting, and his reaction to all these things is interesting as well. When he's called out, for being bad at the game, for throwing matches, essentially, you know what I mean, wasting other people's time, he responds arrogantly and claims that everybody else, on the planet has a problem, except for him, in so many words, right? So I think that Roach incident is very interesting as well, and I think a lot of that comes down to hedonism. I think that if you die once in this type of WoW campaign that they're doing, maybe it's a permadeath, and he didn't want to risk actually dying for some sort of selfish reason like that. I may have the details slightly wrong on that. I'm not really like a World of Warcraft person, and so I apologize about that. But the other thing I want to talk about is his tendency to make these video games and then have them sort of become abandonware. And I think that gets back to hedonism as well. He wants to belong to these different groups, including the indie, game developer group. And so he, hypes it up, and he is apparently an effective marketer and apparently an effective communicator, and has the ability to put on some sort of fake, voice in a way that's not his natural voice, similar to that Elizabeth woman there from Theranos. Elizabeth, I forgot what her name is. The woman that faked her voice there in the Theranos, the blood company, and she stole all these billions of dollars on a fake idea. She would fake her voice in that same way as well. And so this guy, was doing that and telling everybody, I'm going to do these video games. And then he went on Kickstarter and said, support me doing these video games. And apparently he raised 20, 30, 40,000 dollars, US dollars, for these projects, and released, some work that, let's just say, was short of what the expectations were, what was promised. And from what I understand from other people's videos, that he was using something called Game Maker to create one of those two games. And essentially he was supposed to finish it in the year 2017, which was of course 8 years ago. And in the following 8 years, almost nothing has happened. And so essentially, he's streaming every single day and fighting with people on the internet, and kind of joking around, getting donations on his stream, trying to defend his reputation, you know what I mean? Trying to make excuses, trying to say when he's off camera, that he's working on his game. But it's pretty obvious to me that his hedonism and possibly something like perfectionism and everything is just catching up with him. I've promised things and been stressed and not able to deliver on things on time. And you have to be honest with people and say, I'm behind on this, or I'm not doing as well. But from what I've seen on these videos, he's not doing that, and he's not actively learning how to become a better developer to be able to make his video games easier over time. He's just wasting his time playing video games and trying to get money with streaming. And so I think it's more pleasurable for him, as a hedonist, to just stream out there, you know what I mean, and to defend his reputation. And it's not fun for him to learn development, because he's not a great developer. Just being honest with you, he's a beginner to intermediate level. He may have watched some YouTube tutorials 10, 15, 20 years ago. He may have read some books. He may have done some very simple projects, but he's not a very capable. And so he would need to keep learning a lot about C++ and Game Maker to be able to make something that's, you know what I mean, a true representation of what someone might have in his head, these grand ambitions that he describes. But he just doesn't want to put in the work to actually deliver on it. And so when it comes time for his deadlines to happen, he's, instead of working, just gets stressed out and plays video games, dicks around, and then makes an excuse and says, oh, I had COVID, you know what I mean? So maybe he did have COVID once, maybe he even had it twice, maybe he did have long COVID or whatever it is, but ultimately when that happens, you've got to, if you're really a driven person, you know what I mean, you say, listen, best friend, I need you to kind of take the reins on this project. I'm completely out of commission. There are people that are counting on me. I delivered $40,000, and so when we get this done and we get some sales in, if you take over this project, I'll give you X percentage of the sales. A businessman would figure out a way to get around the limitation. So he's the bottleneck in the project. Let's just talk business for a second, right? So this is a business. He wants to sell this to make money. And the problem is that the product isn't done because he's the only person really working on it, right? And he doesn't want to work on the project. Let's just be real. He's a hedonist, you know what I mean? And it doesn't please him to work on this project. It pleases him to get the praise, for finishing the project and for being an indie dev, but he doesn't want to learn, and he doesn't want to, you know what I mean, really sit down and actually grind for, 25, days straight to make something happen. And so what could he do otherwise? Like I said, he could give some equity away to people, in exchange for future things. He could take some money anyway and just pay someone a little salary, you know what I mean? He could go on Upwork or something like that, and he could outsource it, you know what I mean, and pay someone like a foreigner, like a cheaper rate to do it. There's a lot of different options that you could do. You could just quite simply say, the project's postponed, you know what I mean? I'm just too sick or whatever. I don't think that I can give you guys the quality that I promised if I offload this to somebody. But he's not being forthcoming with it, and that just really comes down to shame. I think he's ashamed of himself, for biting off more than he can chew, and that he wants to sort of bury this in a way, and move on to the next quick dopamine rush that he's going to get. And so, now he's just buried himself so deep in this hole, and people are starting to call him out on it and say, like, hey, we've noticed that, you're not walking the walk. You know what I mean? You're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk. And there's a misalignment between what you're promising me and what's actually happening. You know what I mean? And so the covenant that you have established with me has been broken, and you're acting as if it's not. And so that really comes down to, I'm a special boy, and you guys don't matter, and it doesn't matter that I've broken the covenant, so to speak. You know what I mean? That I've refused to deliver on these games. You know what I mean? And I refuse to get better as a programmer, and I refuse to refund people, that have supported a project that's probably never going to come out. And I'm just you know what I mean? I think he should just be honest about it and say, I'm not good enough to be able to pull off this project like I thought that I could. It stresses me out every single time that I want to work on it. And the truth is also that, I'm a little bit of a pig-headed person, and I don't like when people call me out on that because I've been a little bit of a baby, and baby don't like getting spanked. And he's been spanked very hard by the internet. and his reaction has been very, 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 very defiant, essentially. And so, anyway, I think this has gone on long enough, but those are my thoughts on some of the things that I've seen that's been going on with this guy called Pirate Software. He wants himself to be a successful person, but he doesn't want to actually do the work that it will take to make that happen, and he's mad at himself and mad at the world and projecting it at everyone for those exact reasons. And so, don't harass anybody that was talked about in this video. If you have any thoughts on this, politely put them in the comments. I'd like to know what you think about the topic. And if you like this kind of thing, give me a like and subscribe. Maybe I'll talk about something else. All right. Have a good day.